Okay. Thank you. Yes. Well, I hope my brain is also going to be able to function well tonight and to teach you by the grace of God, by His Spirit. Yes. Sometimes I feel like I'm a bit kind of close sometimes, but it's hard to kind of gauge because you kind of set it up like this and then sit back. Anyway, Revelation chapter 12 is where we were looking at. Revelation 12. And it's sort of following on really the same image that we've been looking at. This continues for quite a while, so that could be helpful or not if you've not seen the other Bible studies. So Revelation 12, and tonight we're going to do verses 5 and 6, and I shall just read those out to you. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So I'm just taking a few verses at a time, because otherwise it's like, wait, what? You know, it gets confusing. So here we have, I believe, confirmation that the woman that's described in Revelation 12 verse 1 and some of the verses after that is really a representation, an allegory, if you like, of the Old Testament church, the ecclesia. That is the word that's used in Acts 7, same word that we use for the New Testament church. It just means congregation, assembly. You can translate it like that, and it just really means the people of God. You know, there were people of God in the Old Testament and there are people of God in the New Testament, and what I said to you last week, I think it was, or the week before, that assembly of believers, those Old Testament saints, represent the genealogy of Jesus according to his flesh, his earthly side. And they are, in that sense, bringing forth this man-child who is Christ. That's his family tree. And he's kind of, according to his flesh, that's where he's coming from. So, you know, we've got, if you go through the genealogy, it talks about, you know, Abraham, David, you know, Isaac, these kind of godly men who are in the line of Jesus. So that's what I believe. It's bringing forth a man-child, Christ himself, who, it says, to quote, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Now this is more or less a quote from Psalm number 2. So let's have a look at it. Psalm 2. And yes, so if we start in verse 7 of Psalm 2, I will declare the decree the Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. And this is it really. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Then it goes on to say, Be wise now therefore, O ye kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. This is a side to Jesus we don't always think of. You know, we always think of Jesus being compassionate and loving, and he is all those things. But he's also the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. You know, he will execute justice on the earth. And so these verses are really about submitting to Christ, and it really concerns all nations and all powers, and every person that has ever lived and every person that ever will live. This is kind of an ultimatum. It's saying, you know, Christ rules the nations with a rod of iron. In other words, with a rod of correction and judgment. You know, that is the role of the Son of God. And we see this kind of judgment in, if you look at history, we can see that when the Jews persisted in unbelief, God allowed the Roman army to bring their city, their temple, their nation, and their religious practices to an end. That is like God, I believe, God the Son, bringing judgment upon them for their unbelief. But again, we see when Rome would not submit to Christ, he allows their empire, perhaps the greatest the world had ever seen, to be destroyed. And there will come a time when every power, every principality, Bible says, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, whether they want to or not. And so that is a side to Christ. You know, he'll come as a conquering king. He'll come in the likeness of King David, you know, because he is the Messiah. He's the son of David. When he first came, he came as the suffering servant, right? Suffering and dying for our sins. But when he returns in victory, it will be as a mighty king. So let's have a look at another verse that indicates the same sort of thing. In Acts chapter 3. Yes. So Acts 3, this is actually sort of taking Old Testament prophecy, really. So I'm in Acts 2, that's why I can't see it. Here we are. Yes, so this is a quote from Deuteronomy 18:15, but Peter takes hold of it here in Acts 3, and he makes it refer to Jesus. He says this is a prophetic fulfillment from Deuteronomy that's fulfilled in Christ. And verse 22 of Acts 3 says, for Moses truly said unto the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear that prophet shall be destroyed among the people. Yea, and all the prophets from Samuel and those that follow after, as many as have spoken, have likewise foretold of these days. In other words, the days of the gospel, the days of Christ's coming. So he's saying someone will come who is your brethren, he's Jewish, he'll come and he'll be like this super prophet, if you like. We know Jesus is more than a prophet, he's the Son of God, but he's also a prophet. And whoever doesn't hear him shall be destroyed from among the people. So that's this kind of idea. So going back to Revelation now, of this rod of iron, he will rule the nations with a rod of iron. And then it goes on to say, where is it? It goes on to say that he shall be caught up to God. And again, verses like, whom the heaven must receive. These verses are talking about really the ascension of Christ, that he will be caught up to God. Yes, her child was caught up to God and to his throne, it says there in Revelation 12 verse 5. So I believe this is, yes, a picture of Christ, and that therefore the woman in this aspect represents that Old Testament genealogy that brought forth Christ, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, that kind of aspect to it. But then I think we come also to a sort of interesting duality to the interpretation of these verses. So yes, I've already covered that idea that the woman represents the Old Testament saints, David, Abraham, Noah, bringing forth, being the ancestors of Christ. But also the woman, I believe, represents the New Testament church. And I taught about how we, through the gospel, bring forth Christ in believers, right? Through the power of the gospel. That's what we're trying to do, isn't it? We're trying to get people to believe on Jesus and then to become more and more like Christ, so that we can say it's no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me. So in that sense, the church, the New Testament church, does bring forth Christ, that we use the power of the gospel and Christ comes and dwells within them by his Spirit. So we've got these two kind of interpretations of the woman and of this child, Christ. But then in verse 6 it says, and the woman fled into the wilderness where she hath a place prepared of God. In other words, God has prepared this sort of special place for the woman. So I think that the Roman Catholic Church tend to interpret the woman as being Mary. I don't really go with that. But I guess they would look at when Jesus and his family flee to Egypt in Matthew chapter 2, to escape the wrath of Herod. You remember that Herod slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and all the coasts thereof who were 2 years and under. So he worked out what time the wise men had set off and come to him, and he tried to destroy the child, the infant Jesus. And I guess you could say, well, that's, the wrath of Herod is also like the wrath of the dragon that wants to devour the child. But I think there's more. I don't buy that because I don't believe it really represents Mary. But I think there's a much more interesting and significant kind of interpretation of this idea of the woman fleeing to the wilderness to a special place that God has prepared for her. So if we go back to our sort of historical timeline that we've been following in the history of the church, up to now, the centre of Christianity has been, a few places really. Constantinople, Jerusalem, where else? Alexandria, Antioch. These have been really major kind of Christian places, and they've all, you could say, they're all kind of in the east. And now, like, you have like the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? There's sort of the Coptic Church, the Egyptian Church, and so this has really been where Christianity, its theology, its kind of power base has been. But what happens is there is this great shift, and we're going to be looking more closely at this in the next coming weeks. But the church, theologically, evangelistically, moves to Europe, to I think it's right in saying to the sort of the other side of the Danube, but moving into sort of what would you call it, northwest Europe, I think, sort of Germany and Switzerland and those kind of places. There's this like huge shift where it moves theologically, power base and everything away from the East, to the extent that a lot of people today, when you talk about Christianity, talk about it as if it is a Western religion, and so this is something to kind of ponder, isn't it? Well, why this huge move from the East to Europe, and why now do we kind of consider it more sort of a Western kind of religion? And we will look at that. We'll look at that in more detail in the next coming weeks. But it's interesting that as the church would move, as it would go somewhere that was, if you like, safe, that places like Asia or Africa are pretty much under the control of the Saracens and the Turks, and it's sort of almost like God is making a kind of making a sort of channel, a pathway for the church to move, and to this safe place. Now, coming to our sort of timeline and taking into account what it says at the end of verse 6, that she should be in this safe place where they should feed her, 1,260 days. I'm not going to get into, well, how long was that? I think it's safe to say that it represents a finite period of special kind of nurture and divine protection for the church, that it would last for a while, but not indefinitely. But according to John Wesley, whose sort of timeline we've been following in these studies, he says that the timeline runs from, and he's very specific, he says from the year 847 AD to 1524 AD. He gets those figures from a guy called Bengelius, who did a whole study on Revelation, and Wesley's just basically saying, I think this guy got it right, so that's why he's using it. And I think both these guys perhaps got it right, that's why I'm using it. But those who know their history well will have spotted that this last date, 1524, corresponds very closely to a massively important event that took place regarding the Christian church, and that is the Reformation. The Reformation kicks off sort of officially in 1517, when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and that's like the start really. But before then, there was lots of rumblings about the Reformation. There's people like John Wycliffe in England, and his Lollards, who he sent out preachers. That they copied the Bible into English, or sort of Old English, by hand. The whole Bible, kind of like writing it all out by hand, and then they would take those into the villages and give them to people, so they had the Bible in their own language. But these are really important events, and then like coming later, in the sort of 1530s, I think it would be something like that. You've got the martyrdom of people like William Tyndale and who else? Thomas Cranmer and many other people. So I think this kind of straddles the Reformation, or at least kind of comes very close to it. And I think that's such a big important event in the church. And it's kind of like, you think, as a Christian, if there are these huge events going on, like the church sort of moving from the east to the west and the Reformation, it's like when you read Revelation, why would you be looking to something like in the future? I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder what really big event will happen to the, because these events are just like enormous. They give us the church as it is now. The kind of the idea that we can sit here all with Bibles in our own language. There was a time that just wouldn't be possible. And so I think it's quite exciting, this particular part of Revelation. And what we see is that God has prepared, it's a place prepared of God. In other words, there's a safe and a kind of a convenient place where the true church of God can be fed. That's what it said, didn't it? So verse 6, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God that they should feed her. So it's about feeding the church actually being nourished and growing, just like a child needs a safe place to be fed and nourished. And I think that's what's happening here. Christ, of course, representing Christians in this case, who are coming forth from the church, who are being proselytized, being converted through the power of the gospel. So yes, a safe and a convenient place where the true church of God can be fed and can grow in strength and be protected. I think this is a special divine time of protection where the church can establish herself and her doctrines and be safe from the dragon that we saw last week. You know, of course, is Satan and the devil, as it said. So yeah, I think it's quite exciting stuff, and I will elaborate further. I left a few things out there, but I will elaborate further next week and the following weeks.